Hello folks, hope you're having a great day today. Hey, today I want to take a look at something a little different. What I wanted to do is that I've talked a little bit about my journey as a horror fan and so forth, and how since college I probably read twice as much horror as I had any other genre and so forth. So what I want to do today is kind of talk about why I think that the short story is the best form of telling a horror story. I think it's better than novels that have become more traditional for people to read in the past couple of generations, in the last 30, 40, 50 years, and so forth. And novels have come to dominate, specifically the horror genre, although they also dominate a lot of other genres too. And I think that's probably why people are used to reading novels and novel-length stories. But I don't believe that the novel is the best way of telling a story when it comes to horror. I don't believe that. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at some examples, try to unpack why I think that's the case. Now, I don't think comics are better. I don't think that movies are better and so forth. I actually think that the short story is the best sort of basic form of telling the short story, and I think the short story has the best way of telling a horror story and sustaining that horror over time. Now, what I'm going to do, kind of use for my main example for this, is going to be Ramsey Campbell, and we're going to take a look at one of Ramsey Campbell's novels. I have more than this one, but I think Midnight Sun's a good example of a place to start. And then I also have Ramsey Campbell over here too with the short story collection. In this particular case, this short story collection has a number of Campbell's stories that are written in the Cthulhu mythos. I think this is a collection of all of his Cthulhu mythos stories. And so forth. And these come mostly at the beginning of his career, whereas this is after he's really kind of developed his craft and so forth. And yet there's something more horrifying about these short stories that are quick and get you in and get you out than a book like this, Midnight Sun. So let's take a look at Midnight Sun. Midnight Sun is considered by a lot of Ramsey Campbell fans to be one of his best works. Now, Ramsey Campbell, in case you don't know, is basically the Stephen King of British horror. He's very popular over in Britain. And so forth. He's been around for decades and decades. He writes a lot of novels, and so forth. And the reason why I'm going to be using him as my example, I could use Stephen King or something like that, but Stephen King hasn't written nearly as many short stories as Ramsey Campbell has, which I think helps to compare him to. I mean, I could pull up like Salem's Lot compared to Jerusalem's Lot or something like that, because both of the one's a short story and one's a novel. So I could do that. But the problem is that just King has not. He's prolific as an author of novels. He's not prolific as an author of short stories. But Ramsey Campbell does have quite a number of short stories out there, particularly near the beginning of his career. So again, let's take a look at it. Now, this is Midnight Sun. Now, Midnight Sun was written. It was written in the 80s and so forth. It follows a person over their journey from a young child and up through some other things. It has this area, but that's out in this sort of exotic location, far away from everything, up in the UK. And this family is going to move into the place after this person after our main point of view character, who's now an adult. We spent the first part of this book with as a child, and he had some encounters there as a young child. Now they're going to move there, and so forth. And there's going to be these woods that are right outside of it that are going to be having a growing fascination for our characters until some dark things happen. Midnight Sun is absolutely a classic sort of a horror novel, right? And that's why I'm using this as an example. It's considered by Ramsey Campbell fans to be one of his better novels out there, and so forth. And I would consider it probably one of my top three. I think it lacks some pace in some places, and so forth. I think you could have picked up the pace in a couple of places, but other than that, it's fine. And it's good. It shows Ramsey Campbell sort of at his top of his craft as a writer. He's probably one of the few writers today who has really, I think, now that he's kind of mastered his craft, has kind of gotten to where an Algernon Blackwood or H.P. Lovecraft would be, where they're writing horror stuff, but their horror stuff also has this sense of awesomeness to it and a sense of wonder to it as well, which I think is very important for telling a good and credible story, and so forth. So Ramsey Campbell, again, has definitely evolved to the place where his craft is really strong, and he's churning out some very high quality novels that have some very strong feeling areas and sensations and so forth. But he also wrote a lot of short stories in sort of this, and Cthulhu Mythos and other ones too, that are also set in a horror story. And if you read just one short story out of here, I'm just going to pick one at random. we'll do The Church in the High Street, which I believe is probably going to be in here, which is a Cthulhu Mythos story that he has read that's actually been regularly mythologized. It was the first story I think he published in '62 when he was still a young kid, and so forth. 2 decades before he published his Midnight Sun, even The Church in High Street, which has a lot of issues with it as a story, is a better. It has a better sense of horror than Midnight Sun does, and so forth. It has a quicker sense of horror. There is a real sense of horror, a real sense of when you're reading it, of bad things that are going wrong, and so forth. And you come away with, I think, a stronger sense of horror, stronger scares and so forth, than you would in the entire novel Midnight Sun. Even though Midnight Sun's a better written story. And Ramsey Campbell would admit that. I would admit that. Any Campbell fan is going to tell you that some of his earlier stuff, like Cold Print, The Church in High Street, and some of the stuff that's in here, are definite, and some of the other things that he wrote too, are definitely going to be not as well written as many of his later novels. Everybody knows that. But the problem is that you can't tell horror on a novel scale. And I think the main reason for that is because, unlike other genres, novel requires you to sustain a feeling of horror. And sustaining a feeling of horror over 10 pages is a lot easier than sustaining over 250. And so because of that reason, horror has always, I felt, been better as a short story than in other things. Now the problem is that most modern readers today aren't reading short stories. They should. Not only do I think you can get a lot more read with a short story, but I think there's a lot of genres like horror where that's probably going to be better for you, and so forth. But also I think that the modern reader just isn't used to it. But you can actually read more. I mean, if you were to sit down and take the Cold Print collection, just one example, but there's many other short story examples I could point to. If you were to read one short story a day, it's been maybe a half an hour, reading a single short story a day, you could read 7 short stories a week. If you read one short story a day in a year, you will have read more than 350 short stories. And that's if you skip a few days. If you actually occasionally read 2 or 3 short stories in a day too, because you were just into that author, you could easily read 400 or 500 short stories in a year. If you read a chapter a day from a modern book that's 600 pages long, you're going to read, like, what, 2 books a month? You get my point. We all have such busy days and busy lives and busy things happening. We don't have as much time for reading as we used to. I mean, back in the pulp era, in the Penny Dreadful era that came before that and so forth, reading was our primary pastime because we didn't have television. You were in the early days of radio, film, and so forth. And other forms of media that then came along, and even, and so forth, and even through the 50s and the 60s, and so forth, as newspapers, magazines became even more dominant, and television became more part of our culture, we were still reading more novels and more short stories and so forth, and our reading consumption was, as our part of our pastime, was much higher. Today we don't have as much time to devote to these sort of things. I mean, we have so many more things competing us for our entertainment dollars. I mean, I play games. I love games. I can't have a day where I'm not, like, playing 2 or 3 video games a day or something like that, or at least a week, and something like that. I really enjoy video games and board games. Just last night, before I recorded this, we played a 3-hour version of a 7-person Scythe board game, as in episode 3 of the campaign, which, if you understand board games or anything like that, you'll understand a 7-person campaign, in the Rise of the Fenris campaign, for 7 people and so forth. Loved it. 3 hours, and so forth. I'm playing games all the time, and that's not the only thing, right? And so there's a lot of demand for my time in today's day and era, and that's true for most of us. And so forth. So the short story, I think, is also better for a modern reader too, because it's much easier to invest the time to read a short story a day than it is to invest the time to read one chapter out of a big giant novel once a day too. But similarly, I think that horror, though, in particular, really benefits from them, because you can read a short story. You can read a classic horror short story. It's 15 pages long. And one of the things I actually like to do is, after I come home from work, around 8 or 9 p.m. or something like that, I'll actually take a bath, and I'll be in my bath for a half an hour to an hour as a way to relax, unwind, and so forth. And I'll typically read a short story then too, or a chapter of a book if I'm currently reading a book. And again, I just sort of enjoy that sort of devouring of stories and so forth. And I think that this is not just a Ramsey Campbell thing. And Ramsey Campbell's a great writer. I think it's true of almost every single writer out there for horror. Even Edgar Allan Poe, for example, who is considered a master of horror. He actually wrote a novel. Now, the novel isn't the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym from Nantucket isn't, I think, probably properly classified as a horror novel. It's probably classified in like an adventure genre or something like that. But you get the idea. His novel isn't nearly as good as his short stories, and that's true for anybody. You know, here I got a couple of examples of people I pulled out for you. Shirley Jackson, heavily known and person in the horror genre. Her best novels, and an example of one of her best novels is right here, is The Haunting of Hill House. I don't think it's better than her best short stories. In fact, I think her best short stories, like The Lottery, are just so much better than her best novels. And I think that's true for lots of other people too. I think that was true for people like Fritz Leiber. I think that when Fritz Leiber tries novels and novellas in the horror genre, like this one right here, The Dealings of Daniel Kesserach, I don't think it's as good as his short stories. His short stories was just better as a craftsman, and he is somebody who's won Hugos for novels. He knows how to write a novel. let's not. But it's just his horror stuff is just so much better when it's a short story, and that's not. And I would put modern crafts people. There are some modern people who have been writing horror for the last 20, 30, 40 years, like a Poppy Z. Bright or Thomas Ligotti, who are just so much better than a Stephen King. The current modern masters of short story horror are just such a stronger set of writers and have such a more powerful and horror evoking palette than does any modern writer of horror who writes novels almost exclusively or even occasionally. Horror is just better told, better sustained at a shorter version, because horror, unlike other genres, you have to have just a quick sense of feelings and so forth. And then what ends up happening, Ramsey Campbell's Midnight Sun is a good example. I just mentioned to you. Its pacing isn't as great as it could be. You could probably remove like at least 2 or 3 chapters and so forth, and still have the same story and still be fine. So they have to do backgrounds. They have to do like some other things that are happening that aren't in a horror genre. They got to combine their horror genre with another genre in order to make it good. Or still compelling as a novel, or they just kind of lose it. They just cannot sustain horror as for an entire book like you can over a short story. A quick short story that's 15, 20, 25 pages long, like a Thomas Ligotti novel, or a short story rather, or Poppy Z. Bright's another good example if you're familiar with his writing, are just so much better and so much more evocative, and then you're going to find from any modern novel teller. And again, I think that's true of horror more than any other genre that's out there. For example, fantasy. I can write an epic fantasy novel that's 400 pages long. That's always going to be an epic fantasy novel for that 400 pages. It'll feel like it the entire time. So for that fantasy, for science fiction, it's the same thing. You can write an epic science fiction novel that's still a not science fiction novel for its entire time, feels like a science fiction novel, and can be great for the entire duration of a novel. That's true for romance. It's true for adventures and drama and so forth. And sports novel, whatever, kids novel, whatever you're talking about. Novels and other genres can remain that genre, can do all the key things that genre wants to do at novel length. They're fine. And so I think that's the problem. I think most modern audiences are expecting to read novels, so they go into horror expecting to read novels too, and they grab Dean Koontz or something. But the problem is that the best writers of horror novels are still not doing anything in comparison to the high quality short stories that are being written at that same time. So I would compare short stories that were being written in the 1930s against novels that were being written in the 1930s. I'd compare it from in the 1890s to I think that you're going to find better horror short stories in the 1890s than you're going to find with Dracula or something like that. Although, again, Dracula has been my favorite novel for a long period of time, so I'm using that as a good example. But I would consider the Arthur Machins and so forth that are writing during the 1890s in that era to be better at their craft than a Bram Stoker. or other writers that are writing novels at the same time. And I think that's true up through today. I think that when you are reading a horror novel that's been written in the last 20 years, in the 2000s, in this century, at the same time, reading the best horror short stories, the short stories are always going to be better during that era. They're going to be faster, they're going to be stronger, and again, you don't have to dedicate as much time to them either. So not only are they better, I think, as a genre to tell the horror story best and to best capture that sort of feel of horror, that sort of and dire circumstances and so forth. But I also feel that they're also good for you because you don't have to invest as much time in them either as a reader. And thus you can read a whole lot more short stories in the same time that you would read a novel. So there you are. Those are my thoughts about why I consider the short story to be the best method of telling horror. So what do you think? Do you agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments below and so forth. I'd be happy to engage with you more on that topic, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. And hey, if you like this video, feel free to hit that subscribe button. I really try to unpack a lot of reviews for a lot of forgotten classics in fantasy, science fiction, and horror, and so forth. And I do occasionally like to take a sidebar for a conversation like this when I think it's appropriate on one of those topics. And today I want to talk to you about horror, because I do think horror, I think the science fiction in horror, I think is oftentimes a forgotten part of it, but it should be really more embraced by folks than it is today. And if you like this video and you spend some time invested in it, I appreciate it. Because like I mentioned in this video, we all have busy days. We all have busy lives. So the fact that you spent some of that with me, that's something that's really humbling, so I appreciate that. So thanks again.